Hello, I am Alma Selecki, and I am the moderator for this session called Rethinking Basic Income, Challenges to Universality and Uniformity of Payment. The session is brought to you with support of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, Humanity Forward Foundation, Aid Kit, and STEADY. Once we get started, if you would like to submit a question to the speakers, please post it in the Ask a Question section at the bottom of your screen. You may also vote on questions already posted by other attendees. This will help us focus on the questions you're most interested in. There's also a chat box on the side where you can hold side conversations, introduce yourselves, say where you're from, and this is where we'll post any links and supplemental information. This session is being recorded. All right, now let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Annie Miller. Annie is an economist and chair of the Citizens Basic Income Trust in the UK. She was a founding member of a number of networks related to basic income, including the Basic Income Research Group in the UK, which became the Citizens Basic Income Trust, the Basic Income European Network, which became the Basic Income Earth Network, or BIA, and the Basic Income Network of Scotland. She is the author of several books, including A Basic Income Handbook, A Basic Income Pocketbook, and Essentials of Basic Income. With some visuals there. Wonderful. Our next speaker will be Julia Maskivker, who is a professor of political theory at Rollins College. Her areas of research include theories of justice, the nature of work, and democratic theory. She is the author of Justice and Self-Realization, a liberal perfectionist defense of freedom from employment, and of the duty to vote. And last but certainly not least is Evelyn Forget. Evelyn is professor of economics and community health sciences at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Her research examines the health and social implications of poverty and inequality. Her most recent books are Basic Income for Canadians, From the COVID-19 Emergency to Financial Security for All, and Radical Trust, Basic Income for Complicated Lives. That's a great title. I wish I had stolen that from my own book. We are going to begin with brief presentations by Annie, Julia, and Evelyn on their proposals for how a basic income should be structured. And then we'll have a conversation among our panelists first, and then we'll go to our audience Q&A. All right, so Annie, I'm going to start your slideshow.
Thanks very much, Almaz. It hasn't happened yet. Oh, here we are.
There we go.
Thanks. Right, Rethinking Basic Income, Challenges to Universality and Uniformity of Payment. Thanks. Next slide, please.
That's me, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, please. I just want to quote the case for a basic income. Thomas Paine, whom you in the US will all have heard of, provided a justification for a basic income when he argued that the land and natural resources belong to the people, and where it has been appropriated for private use, those owners owe a ground rent to the whole excluded population. More recently, we've noted that our economies are built on the infrastructure and material heritage of previous generations, and who is to say whose forebears they were? And more recently still, a 2005 World Bank study found that most of the nation's wealth derives from intangible capital, from human capital and the quality of its institutions, especially the rule of law. The wealthier the nation, the more this is so. So these indicate that we have a whole lot of resources which should be available to all of us. Next slide, please, Almas. Thus, a basic income can be justified as a dividend from the fruits of the economy, which is underpinned by these resources, heritage, and institution. An earlier name for this idea is social dividend. This was used during the middle of the last century. It implies that everyone within the jurisdiction is entitled to an equal dividend. Now, I write here, a basic income is not defined in terms of an objective, such as an adequate income or an expected outcome. But I would like to make it more forcefully and say that a basic income is not a policy objective. It's an instrument which can be part of a strategy to achieve welfare objectives such as freedom, security, and justice. So basic income is not a policy, it's an instrument. And it's important to recognize that limitation. Next slide, please. Now, although basic income seems to be a very simple concept, it's deceptively simple and very difficult to define. And one of the things I've been concentrating on in the past 2 or 3 years is looking at its definition. Now, Byang's definition, which was agreed at the General Assembly in 2016, states the following. A basic income is a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. That is, basic income has the following 5 characteristics. Periodic. It is paid at regular intervals, for example, every month, not as a one-off grant. Secondly, it's a cash payment. It's paid in an appropriate medium of exchange, allowing those who receive it to decide what they spend it on. It is not therefore paid either in kind, such as food or services, or in vouchers dedicated to a specific use. Thirdly, it's on an individual basis. It is paid on an individual basis and not, for instance, to households. I think the word would be clear if it said, not, for instance, on the basis of couples or household. Fourthly, it's universal. It's paid to all without means test. And fifthly, it's unconditional. It's paid without a requirement to work or to demonstrate willingness to work. Again, I find those very male-orientated, and I would just prefer it to say it is paid without a requirement to work or to demonstrate any behavioral requirements, which would cover things that covers women's things like being required to fulfill gender roles and that sort of thing. So that's the current definition. Next slide, please, Almaz.
Yep.
But
I went too far. Yeah, sorry, I went too far.
It's clicked on again. Can you go back one? Thank you. There's some problems with Byang's current definition. Universal has sometimes been wrongly, that's back too far. It's been wrongly interpreted as meaning not just that it's delivered to everyone, but it has the same amount, meaning everybody receives the same. But universal merely indicates who will be entitled to the basic income and not the amount. Also, the current Byang definition does not preclude different amounts being paid to men and women, for instance, or according to sexual orientation, race, religion, educational attainment, or even height. It only precludes differences according to means, that is either income or wealth. In other words, it will permit discrimination against less favored groups. And this is very much against the liberal and inclusive characteristics of the other characteristics. Also, it doesn't preclude discrimination against married or otherwise cohabiting couples, who are often denied the household economies of scale enjoyed by non-cohabiting adults sharing accommodation. If discrimination is to be avoided and for people to receive the same, then the new characteristic uniform must be introduced. Next slide, please. So a new characteristic uniform. Universal, the fourth one, says it is paid to all without means test. And I'd like to just note that without means test implies that, first of all, a basic income is not granted according to pre-existing financial circumstances. This is one of the conditions that Philippe Van Parijs introduced way back in 1986, when he was defining a basic income in terms of its liberating characteristics. But also, if it's without means test, it presumably implies that a basic income is exempt from taxes on income. In other words, it's represented by an intercept on the net disposable income axis. Now, uniform has similarities to both universal and unconditional, and should be placed between them as the new characteristic number 5. So the new characteristic number 5 would become uniform. The amount is the same or equal for everyone within a given jurisdiction at a given time, but does not vary according to pre-existing specific characteristics or circumstances. I can't remember. No, I've got another slide to come. Next one, please, Almaz.
Yes.
Now, obviously, if you've got a basic income which is individual, universal, uniform, and unconditional, then there are going to be some cases which are not dealt with. So here I just want to look at some cases for differentiation and consider how to deal with them. A basic income program provides the foundation for a cash transfer system on which individuals can base with income from other sources, including other cash benefits for which a basic income is not a good substitute. And there are some obvious cases for differentiated benefits. For instance, tax-exempt cash disability benefits to cover the extra costs incurred by disabled people, not just to survive with dignity, but in order to achieve their full potentials, could be paid in a separate system to disabled people and their paid carers, in addition to the basic income. Now, I don't mind if they're actually delivered together, but they should be devised under 2 separate systems. The basic income is the foundation, and then disability benefits is a separate system on a different basis from the basic income. Now, another example, for instance, in the UK, for jurisdictions with great variation in house prices and rents, a separate system of meeting housing needs and related costs may have to be devised or retained. Now, in the UK, we have a crazy housing policy in which anybody with money is invited to speculate on property using homes for their speculative investments instead of using them as homes for everyone. And so obviously the housing policy should change as well, not just the extra differentiated benefits for those with housing needs. And I suspect that the way it would be kept in the UK would be as a means tested benefit of some sort, which I don't like, but there are some cases where they are the best situation in a particular situation. Last slide, please, Almaz. So another example where you might want differentiation is where you've got great climatic variations. For instance, I look at the map of Chile, which is long and thin and goes from almost near the equator down almost to the Arctic. And there must be enormous great climatic variations, with some facing very cold climates and some facing very hot climates. And so that jurisdiction has to make a judgment about how best to protect those who face the harshest conditions. And I don't feel it's up to me to say how that should be, but I acknowledge that it needs to be made. Now, some cases for differentiation in the UK, based on ill health conditions, for instance, may be met more effectively and efficiently via public welfare services. We have a National Health Service, which is very popular with the people, very unpopular with our government, who would like to privatize everything and make it more expensive and more inefficient. And we're currently fighting that. Some people say that the cash benefits should be differentiated according to regional costs of living within a jurisdiction. But my own speculation is that in most cases, this will merely exacerbate the situation. For instance, if you get an extra benefit for London, it just makes London even worse off. Whereas if you keep the same, there's some advantage in people moving out from London, as they did down during the lockdown, and moving to cheaper areas. But often it's going to be the poorer people in that jurisdiction who feel the pressure to move, leaving their networks and social networks and so on to make a move to another place. But anyway, this is just cases for cash benefits. And I think what I'm really asking is that a basic income should keep its definition of being universal and uniform. And where we have these other benefits, we shouldn't call them a basic income. They should be called what they are, maybe a means-tested benefit or another type of benefit, and keep the definition purely for the basic income. There are lots of different types of benefits, and the basic income has this foundational function, and I think it's very important. And if we don't, I mean, I would like our academic work to be the foundation for advocacy, in order that people use the same term for the same concept, not different terms, and then they find they're talking at cross purposes. And it can avoid false expectations or being charged with for misrepresentation and that sort of thing. And also it avoids political opportunism if we can keep a strict use of terms based on our academic work. We're all academics, so I think we can all appreciate that. I think that's my 8th slide, so thanks very much, Alnaz.
Thank you, Annie. That was very clear, and I think a great foundation for the rest of our conversation. Now I'd like to invite Julia Maskivker to give her proposal for basic income. Just need to unmute. Let's see. There.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I don't have slides and my presentation is pretty short. Looking forward to the questions. So just to clarify, I come from a political theory, political philosophy perspective here, and my position is probably going to be a little controversial for many people here. First off, I'm very sympathetic to arguments for a basic income. I have been in my work and in my teaching. I am very sympathetic to arguments for a basic income based on the idea that we deserve freedom from necessity. We deserve the freedom to live our lives according to our own very criteria of what a good life is. That we deserve a basic income, or that we may have a right to a basic income based on the idea that it's a good thing to live in a society without exploitation and domination at the workplace. So I don't have any issues with those arguments and principles. My quibbles or doubts about a uniform basic income basically stem from a preoccupation about equality. The idea that basically concerned with the definition of equality, or how we conceive of equality when we think about a uniform basic income. My basic challenge to the basic income that is dispensated or disbursed in a uniform way is that it treats different people identically. It puts the notion of identical treatment at the center of our views about equality. My argument is that if we care about equality truly, we should consider people's interests in an equal manner, which entails different treatment according to different situations, original situations, economic, social backgrounds that people differentially enjoy. What this amounts to in terms of implementation or actual practice of the basic income would be a gradated or gradual basic income in which not everyone gets the same amount of resources, and some may even get nothing. To put it colloquially or in common language, in advanced societies like ours and in not so advanced societies like where I'm from, for example, Argentina in Latin America, there are vast differences in wealth and income, and a lot of people don't need a basic income. And I think that if we admit it, that equality requires that they don't get one, we will be able to benefit others that may need it much more in a much more clear way. So in my work, I argue that we do have already the categorical tools or the taxonomical tools that we might need to implement this idea of a graduated basic income. It is true that not everybody pays taxes. So we would need further bureaucratic innovations, but I don't think those would be difficult to devise. Again, I'm no economist. I'm only a political and social philosopher. So this technical work escapes me. But I think that the principled idea that equality and justice may call for differential treatment according to people's original situations and current backgrounds is not an idea that doesn't make sense from an egalitarian perspective, especially in societies like ours where vast differences in wealth are the current norm, and those differences are widening. So one last thing I wanted to add, I am not against the idea of universality as a moral principle. I think that we can conceive of universality as a qualified sort of moral condition. There are many rights that are universal, but are not automatically universal. The right to vote is universal, but not everybody enjoys it. You have to be of a certain age, right? The right to paternity or maternity leave could be thought of as universal, but not everybody enjoys it unless they have a child that's born. I think the right to a basic income could be thought in the framework of this notion of qualified universality, where everyone is in principle entitled to it on account of citizenship or humanity, but not everyone automatically might receive it in the same way without further investigation into their own situations. I think I'm going to stop there because that's basically the overall of my argument here.
Okay, thank you so much, Julia. Lots of questions I want to ask, but first let's get Evelyn's. First, let's get Evelyn's proposal on the table, and then we'll start the conversation among the panelists.
Well, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be joining you from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Canada today. I don't have slides either, and if you only remember one thing that I'm going to say here, I want to say that context matters. Context matters. And I'm saying that because I'm approaching this whole question of basic income from a very pragmatic as opposed to a theoretical perspective. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit is a basic income that I think would work for Canada. And it's really important to remember, I think, that what a basic income might look like, a feasible basic income might look like in Canada, could be very, very different and would be very, very different from the kind of basic income I'd advocate for a low or middle income country. And it might be very different even for other high income countries. I think we have to take into account a number of different things. And in particular, the three things that I want to make sure I mention is that when we think about a basic income, we have to think about what other programs are already in place. Secondly, what recent political experiences has a particular jurisdiction had with basic income or basic income-like programs? Because that's going to influence political acceptability. And thirdly, what's the administrative capacity of the place you're in? Can you do the kinds of things you'd really like to do if the world were perfect and everything worked the way it was supposed to? So with all of that in mind, I want to talk about a very particular kind of a basic income that I didn't write. This has actually been written by a number of basic income advocates in Canada over the last several weeks. And this version of basic income is making its way around the country, looking for endorsements from similar kinds of, allied organizations across the country. So it doesn't talk about design details, but it sets out the minimum requirements for what we would consider, and I'm fully in accord with this, what I would consider, let me use myself, an acceptable basic income. So what would a basic income look like in Canada? I think one of the things that we'd focus on is who exactly would be eligible. And when we talk about a basic income, we tend to focus on everybody who's living in Canada, all citizens and residents of Canada, aged 18 to 64 years. Now that sounds very weird, But we already have two programs in place. We have a child benefit that deals with families with kids up to the age of 18, minor children. And we've also got, which is a sort of a basic income, and we've also got a sort of a basic income in place for seniors in this country. The great gaping hole in our social programs is for working age adults, those aged 18 to 64. So in the first instance, I think we'd be looking at that age group. Secondly, we like to say that benefits should be sufficient to cover basic needs and ensure that no one falls into poverty. That is, it's not just a few $1,000s a year that's a top up to whatever other programs are in place, but it's actually enough to live on. Although enough is a matter of some considerable debate. Benefit amounts will be determined based on taxable income. It's an income-tested benefit with provision to rapidly accommodate changes in income and family composition. Benefits would be reduced gradually as other taxable income increases. So it's just an income-tested benefit. Would be paid on a regular schedule, biweekly or monthly, paid to individuals, not to households, not to couples, but to individuals. And most importantly, I think no behavioral conditions would be applied. No work requirements, no educational requirements, no skills training is mandated. They might be made available, but they're not required as a condition of accepting the money. You're not required to, as Annie said, you're not required to engage in gender appropriate roles like taking your kids to clinics or making sure your minor children attend school. The money's yours by right. Importantly, it would be designed based on collaboration between various levels of government, federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments, recognizing the differences that might exist across the country. It would be guaranteed by the federal government based on legislation which establishes basic income as a right. Importantly, again, the basic income guarantee should be an essential component of broad, publicly funded universal supports and services. So it doesn't replace all other services out there. Certainly wouldn't replace any publicly delivered social, health, or educational services. Might replace other cash transfers, but not services. The basic income guarantee would not restrict access to any current or future benefits meant to meet exceptional, special, distinct needs and goals. Things like disability supports, for example, that would be in addition to a basic income. This needs to be financed. And if you talk about financing a basic income, you can't talk about how you deliver a basic income without thinking about how you're going to pay for it. And when you look at that other side of the coin, the principles we'd be looking at for financing a basic income were the principles of tax fairness. That is, changes to the tax system that contribute to lowering income and wealth inequality. So we look both at the money paid out and how we're going to get the money to pay for this in the first instance. So that's what a basic income would look like. And so I just want to go back to my notion of context. Context matters. Why would I support an income-dependent basic income guarantee in Canada rather than a universal guarantee? And I think I want to mention some recent history in this case. We have some experience in Canada with benefits that are paid out to everybody uniformly or more or less uniformly. And then for people with high incomes, they're recouped through the tax system. So you pay it out uniformly, April comes along, you complete your income tax form, and you pay it back. That used to be the case for seniors' pensions. Pensions were paid to everybody, but starting at about $70,000 or $73,000, if your income reaches that level, the pension's lowered and you pay part of it back to the government, and eventually it disappears at $120,000, $130,000 a year. Now, nobody in Canada earning $70,000 a year is poor. The pensions are quite small. Nobody was in hardship, but this caused outrage. This caused outrage in Canada. People were furious that the government was giving them money with one hand and taking it back with the other. It made people very, very angry. It made them so angry that they stopped paying the pensions out on a universal basis and started income testing it at source. We have another recent example that's not quite the same, but it's very similar. During the pandemic, the federal government introduced something called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. And this was put in place because employment insurance is such a god-awful mess in this country, and it would have been completely overwhelmed if people went to that system, but it was put in place. And the whole thing was designed in the space of about 3 weeks and rolled out. And the decision was made that if you lost your job, you'd get a certain amount of money. And at the end of the year, they'd, figured out when you completed your tax forms. And if you had an income above a certain level, you could pay it back. And we could settle things up at the end of the year. Well, that caused incredible fury. The total payments were really quite modest, and the total amount paid back was relatively modest, except it caused fury. Now, people knew this at the outset. They knew this was taxable income. They knew it would be taxed and the adjustment would come at the end of the year, but they were still furious that they were asked to pay the money back. So those two examples, I think, are enough for me to say that in Canada, no government is ever going to deliver a basic income universally with the notion that somehow we'll settle it up in April when you complete your tax form. And so I think in terms of political feasibility, at least in this country, an income-tested benefit is something that we'd be looking at. As soon as you talk about universality, the conversation tends to swing. And that's, just one example, I think, of why context matters. This is a very specific Canadian case. Would it matter elsewhere? I don't know. I know that in Canada, it's a really important thing. And so I think I'm going to stop there just with repeating my basic point. Context matters. Context matters. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Evelyn, also for yet another very clear presentation. And I think you've given us a lot to think about and to discuss, first amongst ourselves and then in conversation with the audience. So Annie, I'd like to go to you first and ask you if you have any comments or questions for your fellow panelists.
I think you're muted, Annie.
No, we've got you now. Yeah.
Oh, all right. To Julia, about your things, you're saying that you were talking about, I can't remember the text now. I just wanted to say that we do expect people to be taxed. And under Thomas Paine's idea of the basic income, it's those who have appropriated the land would be expected to pay an annual ground rent. Now, for the other basis, there'd be other taxes that would be paid. So it's not that they get it for nothing. And one can design a tax system which tapers off. I mean, I actually favor a tax system, a benefit system, where 80% of the adults would be better off, because then it's going to be more politically acceptable. Another thing that I wanted to point out was that when you think about a basic income or disability benefits or the other examples I mentioned, these can be considered equality from the provider's point of view. And something like adequacy or equality between the recipients is a completely different ballgame. It's far more subjective and far more difficult. For instance, if it's equalization according to the recipient, then you have to ask what is being equalized. Is it some concept of utility if interpersonal comparisons are possible? Is it the same basket of satisfiers? But who's going to decide what that basket is? Because people like different baskets. Is it regional costs of living within a household? Or should we take into account, as I heard in one of the earlier sessions, a person's current endowments, like if they had a happy childhood or family life, or they've had a good education, or they've got good health, should that be taken account, and they should have brownie points taken away from them? So it's a far more difficult concept, and people have tried to go down there, and I've never heard any example where it's convinced me completely that it's actually doable. I'd be interested to hear of an example that might be, but I'm happy with the equalization by the provider. And this, in a sense, is sharing out the resources. It's an equal share of resources rather than an equal utility to the recipient. That's really what I want to say about case for differentiation and so on. No, Evelyn, I agree with a lot of what you say, and yes, national context is important, including things like resources, the climate, infrastructure, culture, constraints, and so on. But what we're actually doing is designing a whole social. That's not my cat.
No, I think that was my background noise outside. Sorry.
Anyway, when we take the concept forward, we're designing a social protection program and some way of financing it to get together as a system. And so all of these things have to be taken into account. The social protection program could include things like the disability benefits and climate and housing. They could even be in the form of means-tested benefits. And you've got other things like social insurance payments, which may be taxable, whereas a basic income would not be taxable. But the point I wanted to make, a lot of what I heard you say, if you've got a targeted benefit and you're taking disposable incomes into account, you're then applying a taper or withdrawal rate. And in effect, these benefits, it's not the benefit that's being taxed, but the incomes of the recipients are being taxed twice. And one of the things that results from this, the taper rate could be as much as 100%, but it could be less. But usually you end up with a very regressive marginal deduction rate, which is very divisive for your community. And not only that, you're introducing disincentive to work for pay effects on low-income people. And I think that's one of the things that's happened in the UK. Together with our investment in housing means that we don't have any investment left into business. And we've had a recession due to austerity. And I suspect that's one of the elements that brings it about. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that problem with means-tested benefits, which is very common. But again, I want to really ask you, if what you're proposing is a means-tested benefit, please use that term and don't call it a targeted basic income or anything else. Let's keep the basic income to be as the Yang defines it, and so I hope they're going to amend it with uniform, and use these other terms so that we don't talk in cross-purposism. And I've listened to other sessions yesterday and today, and they're very interesting. And then I realized they're not talking about basic income, they're talking about some other. And one of the other things, particularly with the US, if the income tax system is based on the household, how are you going to end up with that mechanism giving you an individual-based benefit? And one of the important things of that is for women, because quite often the main income earner is a man. He gets the money, presumably, and it's on a household basis. And even if he gets more money, then the other dependents get less. And so the women are no better off. And it's absolutely essential that it's individual based. Otherwise, women are the poorer for this. And this is one of the ways I came into this concept myself. So.
Okay, I didn't plant that last comment that Annie made, but I did give a paper on joint taxation of couples in the United States and basic income. So thank you for that plug.
In the UK, we actually have individual-based income tax. And this is one of the few things, the only thing I would say that we can thank Margaret Thatcher for. It came in 1990. And I'm sure she said to her husband, whose name I think, Dennis, I really can't go on with you getting all my income tax rebates and me just being the...
Okay, well, I would love to hijack this conversation and start talking about taxes, but I'm going to resist that temptation. All right, thank you so much, Annie, for your responses. Julia, let me give you a moment to respond to what you heard.
Oh, hi, yes. So yeah, thank you so much for those objections or comments, Annie. I appreciate your expertise, your technical expertise. As I said, I'm not an economist, so I don't know if my answer to you will be what you expect. But in principle, I have two types of responses to your response. One would be principled. Yeah, it may be the case that the rich will pay their basic income back in taxes, but why cut them a check? Why cut the likes of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and so many others a check. Secondly, a question of efficiency. Again, I'm no economist, but a system that, as was said in the presentation before, a system that systematically taxes all the benefits that it gives to certain classes of people doesn't seem to be the most efficient system. And going back to the principal point, if we really care about eliminating poverty and maximizing equality, and I know these are not two identical objectives, but especially when it comes to non-developed, non-industrialized, or middle-income countries, if we really care about minimizing poverty, maybe the rich should do their fair share, and their fair share is not just paying taxes, but also not receiving the same benefits that the needy truly necessitate or need. So again, it's a question of principle and a question of efficiency that I'm raising here. And yes, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I think it's great that we're actually getting into this on the level of principle and also on the level of practicality and implementation. I think it's a very rich way to approach this this session's topic. Evelyn, let me give you a moment to respond to your fellow panelists. We can hear you.
I think I'd like to go back to the question of a universal payment, a universal payout versus universal entitlement for a minute. In Canada, we do tend to talk about universality of basic income, meaning universal entitlement to participate in the program. So it doesn't necessarily mean you get the same number of dollars. And I do think that that's one difference. But when you think about paying out the same number of dollars to everybody, you're typically looking at people paying, at the end of the year, paying very different tax rates to compensate. I mean, I know that you can make a universal payout and an income-tested benefit look exactly the same. You can pay for it. The responses are exactly the same. If that's your desire, if that's what you want to do. So I think that these are just two different ways of achieving the same end. I don't see a big difference here. I would like to talk a little bit about the difference between means testing and income testing, though. I think that when people talk about means testing, and I think a lot of the criticism of means testing that I've heard, particularly with respect to welfare programs that exist, is because means testing is a much more intrusive process than simply looking at somebody's earned income or income from other sources. Means testing includes assets of all kinds. It includes the kind of house you live in and whether you can sell some of your assets in order to finance yourself. It includes who else might be coerced into supporting you, if that's a requirement. Who do you live with and what are the requirements? And I think that's the kind of intrusiveness that many people object to when we talk about these programs. I think income testing is a little bit cleaner. It doesn't solve all of the problems. I'd also like to, though, we do have quite a lot of evidence out there about work disincentives associated with tax back rates. And one of the things we found is that there's no really good evidence out there that says that that if you have a tax back rate, people will work less. A guaranteed income does not reduce the amount that people work. And we have that both in terms of experiments that have taken place in the past in Canada and in the US, in other different kinds of programs that have similar kinds of features to it. So there's no evidence to support that. That's something people point to all the time. Critics of basic income, critics of guaranteed income point to the work disincentive effects. But a well-designed program doesn't seem to have them. That doesn't mean you can't set up really badly designed programs that generate them, but a well-designed program doesn't have those effects. So, I don't know.
All right, so if I could just take a moment to summarize what I think the different positions are and the consensus before we move on to some excellent questions that we have from the audience. So Evelyn, you're suggesting that the income-tested basic income that you are proposing for Canada is mathematically no different from a universal basic income that goes to everyone, but is taxed away from the highest earners through the income tax system. What I hear you saying is that for Canada in particular, the experience with similar kind of programs set up that way, where people get money with one hand and have it taken away with another hand, has been politically very, very unpopular, right? And so in another context, for example, thinking about the United States, where last year under the COVID pandemic, we had benefits that went broadly to the population, but not to the highest earners. And because they were sent out by the income tax, the IRS, they had our information from the prior year to go on in terms of who to send it to and who not to send it to, because it was just going to be taxed away if the highest earners got it. And then Julia, what you're saying, you're making a broader point, which you were making that point too, right? That we shouldn't be giving the basic income to Elon Musk, but you accept the idea that it could be a universal benefit, but that's taxed away from the highest earners.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I wanted to clarify something. It's not that Elon Musk shouldn't get the basic income. He shouldn't, but you can be very wealthy without being nearly as wealthy as he is. Mm-hmm. And I think those categories usually get ignored in our discussions of differentiated payments and so forth. You can be a millionaire and not need a basic income and be poor vis-a-vis Elon Musk. And I think that's my main worry concerns these categories of people, very, very, very visible, at least in the United States, that in my mind need normative attention.
But so a basic income that could go to 90% of the population, for example, maybe not the top 10% or 95% and not the top 5%.
Yeah.
That would be acceptable to you.
I think so, yes.
Okay, that seemed to be one point that you're making. And then the other point that you seem to be making was that some people have, even at the same income level, might have different needs. And Correct. You are objecting to the fact that basic income, in a uniform basic income, as Annie Miller was describing, at the same income level, treats people with different situations the same.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
An example was when Iran changed in, I think it was about 2010, and they had their oil revenues, and they were subsidizing fuel for the population, and it led to massive pollution, air pollution. And so they decided they wouldn't subsidize the fuel prices. They would actually distribute some of the oil revenues. So at first they said, oh, they would try and do it according to need, and people complain, oh, they're getting more than me and I need this and so on. And then they said, oh, blow it, we're just going to give the same to everybody. And that actually seemed to please them. And that carried on till 2016, and then circumstances changed and oil prices dropped then. And so the program became under attack. Can I point out too that in the UK, we have a pay-as-you-earn system, so that you don't pay at the end of the year. Your tax is worked out and deducted every month from your earnings. The payroll is worked out. One of the reasons for wanting to give it to everybody is to try to make an inclusive society. And if you say, well, some people are getting it, you're not, then you're immediately saying there's a difference between people in society. And if one wants to try and build a united, inclusive and just society, there's a point to trying to include them. But also there has been an argument to say that when rich people do get it, a universal benefit, they tend to protect it far more for poor people than having a targeted benefit. Anyway, I'm just not very keen on the targeting business, because you're picking out people, you're making a divided society, and that for me is not one of my objectives.
But Annie, you're not objecting to, if we're talking about both the benefit side and the funding side, you're not objecting to it being financed by a progressive tax that hits those highest earners. And you think in the UK, in the UK, there wouldn't be the same outrage that Evelyn was describing in Canada to a benefit that you get with one hand and pay back with the other hand.
I suppose we're used to it already with our PAYC system, pay-as-you-earn system. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then another thing that I just wanted to clarify was that, Julia, you were making the point, as I said just a moment ago, that your conception of justice requires that we treat different people differently, right? So people in different circumstances, and income is just one way of looking at their circumstances, but there are others as well. Annie was suggesting that basic income is just a foundation. It's not meant to replace all the kinds of programs that we might have that would address things like disability, might address things like experience of childhood poverty, gender, unpaid care responsibilities, any other sorts of things. There might be additional benefit programs that we would want to have that would be targeted to those particular needs, but that we want a foundation in society of an unconditional benefit. So I think, Annie, you're nodding, so I think I have your position correct. Julia, do you have a response to that?
To what exactly? I'm sorry. I was reading the comments on the chat.
You have to pay attention.
It's just too many of them, so I was trying to keep track. I'm sorry.
No worries. So the question was, do you have an objection to a basic income that is uniform and universal? Universal in the sense that we've been talking about, could be income tested, not means tested. It could be income tested for higher earners, but that it would be a uniform amount, that goes out in terms of the benefit, and that we would have separate systems that would address, say, housing needs or disability or other needs.
Yeah, in principle, I'm in agreement with that. Although my approach, which I didn't flesh out fully here, obviously, will be consistent with saying that the payment should not be. If we have different tax categories or tax brackets, we could also have different basic income brackets if we want to get a little crazy. But for the sake of efficient implementation, I think the way you summarized the implementation practice, I think I will be in agreement with that.
Okay, thank you. And just the last thing before we get to the audience questions. So audience, don't forget, you can also upvote certain questions so they get to the top of the list, as well as putting in your own questions. I just wanted to also highlight one distinction that Evelyn was making between means testing and income testing. So means testing, you're describing as what we typically understand is done to poor people, which is their income is scrutinized, their assets are scrutinized, their living situations are scrutinized. Whereas income testing, you're defining as this kind of tax recouping from higher earners that we're talking about here. Do I have that right? Yes. That's yes. Okay, great. All right, so let me move to the audience questions here. And our top voted question comes from Michael Howard. Says, in a well-designed UBI scheme, the BI to rich people is clawed back with higher progressive taxes or wealth taxes, just as we've been describing here. So the net transfer from rich to poor can be the same as in a means-tested NIT, negative income tax, or guaranteed income. So isn't a UBI consistent with a reasonable idea of equality? This is for you, Julia, at least with respect to income and wealth.
I mean, that's not incorrect factually, but as I said before, my objection is an objection of principle also, and also of efficiency. Again, someone is saying in the chat, well, the rich can go into public libraries. Yes, of course they can, and they should be able to do that. The rich can go to public school. Although in Latin America, for example, there's a very heated debate about whether the rich or richer should be make some sort of payment to the public system of a university because they end up benefiting from it exponentially more than the poor. The question is, if we have the taxonomical tools to express the idea that the rich should pay their fair share, why are we so afraid to do that?
Would either of the other panelists want to respond to that? No? Okay. All right. Well, you'll have to follow up with Mike Howard later. In our next question, couldn't the problems of outrage, this comes from Fred Weber, by the way, couldn't the problems of outrage based on giving money with one hand monthly and then taking back at tax time be easily solved by taking deductions out of each UBI payment at source based on estimated income, or better yet, last year's wealth?
Yes, that's an income tested basic income. That's exactly what I'm advocating.
Okay.
That's precisely it. And if I can just comment a little bit on the question from Michael Howard a minute ago. People aren't foolish. They know that they're paying higher taxes to finance the basic income, and high income people certainly know what they're paying their taxes for, and that they're paying a lot more. Yes, I know that in terms of talking about the cost of a basic income, it's net costs that matter, not gross costs. But people know that they're going to be paying taxes to finance it, and you've got to take that into account. They know that at the outset. So you can't assume that you're going to create a uniform society, for example, by giving everybody money, and somehow people are going to forget that the rich ones are going to be paying a hell of a lot of money at the end of the year to make sure that this system is in place. They know that's there. So I know that mathematically these two systems come out exactly the same. The question is, what's more feasible? What's more politically acceptable? And I accept that this might be very different in very different places. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks for making that point again. Context matters. Okay, let's see. Our next question comes from Michael Lewis, and it's for Annie. You pointed out that the current definition of basic income allows for discrimination against less favored groups, but it could also allow for discrimination in favor of such groups, as Dorian Warren's UBI Plus proposal, which I take it is a proposal to provide an additional UBI grant as reparations for slavery. I hope that's correct. Do you think there is a case for differentiation in favor of historically and currently oppressed racial groups?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. I would make it separate from the UBI though, so that as with disability benefits, that then the people would get it in addition to their basic incomes. And you could see exactly, if you start putting all these things together, you lose track. What is the basic income? Which is the disability benefit? And what is the reparation? And maybe I'm just simple in my mind. I like to be clear to know what they are. One of the problems with a negative income tax is that the income tax is not necessarily individual based, universal, and unconditional. And combining it with a system that is, it makes it more difficult to check whether your universal basic income is a universal basic income. So I'm just simple-minded and I like them separate. But yeah, sure, there's a case for reparation. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Julia, can you expound on where your cutoff would be for people getting a basic income? You would open up a need to monitor people's incomes for increases and decreases. And I have to say it is problematic for me and many because I come from a perspective that bureaucracy delays getting needs met, and monitoring other people's finances, especially mothers and children, is oppressive and a waste of public resources you just implied should not be wasted. It seems like there's a problem there. This comes from Diane Pagan. Right. So I think actually anyone can answer it, but Julie, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, so I don't have an answer to what the cutoff will be. As Evelyn says, it all depends on context. It all depends on society. The argument that I'm presenting here, I developed in this article, Why a Uniform Basic Income Offends Justice, published in 2018 in the Erasmus Journal for Philosophy and Economics. What I do argue there is that regarding the sort of the bureaucratic nightmare or bureaucratic domination fear, that we do have the taxonomical tools, we do have the sort of economic categories that we need. They may not be enough. When it comes to taxes, we have a way that may not be perfect, and it is not perfect because it is not individualized enough. At least in the United States, it's households that, households can pay taxes, and we lump a lot of individuals in households, right? So that may be a problem, but I don't think it's unsolvable. But we do have the sort of the taxonomical structure that we may need to understand who's a higher earner and who's not. This, again, I'm not an economist, but this doesn't seem to be impossible for a society like this one or any society today, with a minimum sort of state capacity in place to figure out who are the higher earners and who are the middle earners and who are the low earners. So I don't know, probably my response is vague and not technical, but that's basically the intuition.
Okay, thank you. Well, I will say that there was a question in the Q&A section asking Evelyn for a link to the proposal that you said has been making the rounds in Canada, if that's something that you're willing to share and could put in the chat so that people could see it. And Julia, I would invite you to do the same. If you could put a link to your paper in the chat, then people can look at that, your argument in more detail. And I believe the moderators have already put the link to Annie's PowerPoint in the chat as well. But if not, if I can ask one of the behind the scenes moderators to do that, that would be great. Okay, so we have more questions here, lots of great questions from a terrific audience. So let me keep going. I wanted to get to a question from Peter Knight, and this is a question for Annie. Annie, your definition of basic income includes differences in amount for children or seniors that some favor. Can you discuss this? So we had a response to this from Evelyn saying that in Canada there is actually already a child benefit, there's a senior benefit, so she was focusing on a benefit for working age people. Annie, can you address that as well?
Yep, I'm happy to. Now, I must confess that I fell into this trap, and until recently, I said it should be uniform, except that it could vary by age. And when I explored this, I found that if you just have it uniform, you've got the possibility of large household economies of scale for large families, and that could be a problem. But then if it's just your basic income, and that's going to be relatively small, then perhaps that's not a problem. So obviously, when you want to design a basic income scheme, then children, and you want it to be adequate, then children on the whole need less than adults. Now, again, my way of getting around this is to say, yes, I would like my seniors and my working age people to get less than teenagers and younger children. But you can still apply the same system. You've got a UBI, which is what your lowest level would be. For me, it would be children aged, say, 5 to 13. And then you can give extras to add up to an adequacy level for your seniors and your working age. Now, it's a bit of it's a way of getting around this. Adequacy is a problem. What is adequate? What is a benchmark? And for instance, you can have focus groups who work out what they think that their household configuration needs. You can have something like a statistical analysis to estimate what survival levels would be. That's the same as a poverty benchmark. The OECD has its own poverty benchmark, which is 60% of equivalized household disposable income for a couple is the benchmark. And I've got a lot I find wrong with that. I would just rather take a proportion of income per head. And I would go for something like 20% for a child and 40% for an adult, maybe 45% for a senior. But that's just what I've been working on for basic income for an independent Scotland, for instance. Yes, I think that when you come to adequacy, it's got its problems, but we probably do, most of us want to do that. But one of the things to take into account for different groups is there's some studies were done in the Netherlands way back in the 70s, I think it was, when they checked to see what different income groups felt was their poverty level, their survival level. And poor people had a much lower survival level than rich people. Now, if you're going to equalize with respect to the recipient, you've got to give a lot more to rich people because that's their expectation and what they're used to, than to a poor people. Whereas in this system, you are meeting the needs of the poorest people, 10 or 20% of the poorest people, and other people who are richer have to cope and adjust their systems. I mean, I know that during the lockdown, well, with the fuel prices, they put on an extra jersey. I remember as a child, you had a coal fire, your front was baking hot, and your back was freezing. But you were used to living in far more difficult circumstances. So we can adjust. So even rich people, if they do have harder times, at least they will have to live on if it doesn't keep them in sherry at lunch and that sort of thing. So I'm being facetious there, but you get the point. Exaggerate to make my point. So, yeah. Yes, children and seniors and working age, you would expect to give different levels to them.
Yeah, and as Evelyn said, this clearly would depend on the context of a particular country and what other benefit systems are already in place. Are those populations already adequately cared for by other targeted programs or not? Okay, I'm going to try to get in two more questions before our time is up. This question from Alex Howlett. When is it more useful / effective to do the targeting on the benefit side versus the taxation side? How can we tell? Who wants to take that? Evelyn, I see you nodding. You want to do that?
I think that's a really, really good question, and it's something I haven't thought about in detail. I think that I think part of it depends on the nature of your tax system. And he says that in the UK you have immediate adjustment of taxes week by week or whatever, month by month. We don't have that. We don't have that capacity. We do a settle up at the end of the year. There's a withholding tax, but there's no adjustment in the course of the year. And so it becomes very difficult to do that in a timely way. And for a lot of people, even if they know the tax is going to be due at the end of the year, for a lot of people who aren't impoverished but don't have a lot of money, coming up with a few $1,000s is going to make a big difference in April. And so that becomes very difficult, and it's easier to do it on the benefit side to make sure that they don't run into that position. So I keep saying the same thing. I keep repeating myself. It depends on context. And in this particular case, it depends on the machinery of your tax system, I think. How quickly things adjust and what exactly you can do with it.
Great. All right. There's one more question that I really wanted to get to, which is, again, from Fred Weber. Why not a wealth test instead of an income test if you have to test on anything? If we don't want people who don't need it to get it, wealth is a better measure. It's hard to have very high income and not accumulate much of it as wealth. What's everybody's opinion on the wealth tax?
Well, in my approach, this is a very short thing that I wanted to say. In my approach, the testing would not only be income testing, it would also be wealth testing. I think that wealth is a much more important or powerful source of enrichment than income. Another thing that a graduated basic income would do, in my approach, is to distribute the rents of job rents more equally. High earners.
Can you define job rents for
right? Well, I'm thinking about Van Perijk's work and the idea that one of the reasons why the basic income is consonant with justice, he says, is that it's also a good way of distributing job rents. The idea, when we get a wage for our job, the idea is that wage, part of that wage represents an extra incentive that the employer grants us so that we stay, basically. And that makes it harder for others to sort of compete with us regarding that job, right? That's the economic concept of a job rent. When we institute a basic income, and we're not so dependent on income coming from a job, then the concept of a job rent becomes less constraining for those that don't have a job. So when when we give higher earners a lesser basic income or no basic income at all, we're actually being consistent with the idea that they deserve to pay society a higher amount for the job rent that their well-paying job grants them. That's something I developed in the paper, and it's an additional argument for my views. It's not necessarily the most central in any way.
Okay,
Um,
Annie?
I'm very much in favor of a wealth tax, particularly a land value tax of some kind, although it can have, you have to look to see what the unintended consequences are. But I'm also in favor of income tax. I think income taxes are the price of having a good society. And there are some millionaires who don't own wealth, they don't own assets, but they do earn a lot of income. And I don't see why they should go without being taxed. So I think we need both income tax and other types of tax. And they all have their benefits and their disadvantages. So you need to look to see in what context you're applying them, what they're trying to do. One thing that I'm very against, certainly in the UK income tax, we have enormous tax expenditures. That means tax loopholes, which have an enormous cost in tax forgone to the government. I mean, something like if we have virtually a flat tax in the middle between our personal allowance and then a higher rate tax, and it used to work out at 32%. If you applied 32% to the total income of the UK, you would get, you get 32% of that income. And in fact, less than half of that is actually produced in tax. So where's the rest gone? It's gone in perks to rich people. And usually those perks are in proportion to their incomes. One of the worst examples is that if someone pays £40,000 a year into a registered pension scheme, they get tax relief at their current tax rate. If you have an income of more than £150,000 a year, it's 45%. Therefore, they get a free bonus of £18,000, free grants for nothing every year that they do this. And I think that's completely unfair. And one of the arguments is, these people save, that they invest in the economy. Well, these pension schemes don't even have to invest in the UK, so I'm not sure whose economy they're actually increasing. And most of them don't buy, it's change of ownership. They don't actually invest in the economy at all. They invest in housing instead of the economy. So they really should have to be justified. Are they in the public interest? And if not, they should disappear.
Thank you. Evelyn, what about you? In the Canadian context, would a wealth tax fly?
I think in any context, I think I agree with Annie in the sense that I favor all kinds of taxes, and I think you do have to look at taxes. But I think I'm very ambivalent about wealth taxes, because when we talk about wealth taxes, everybody thinks, oh yeah, Elon Musk. But wealth taxes in the real world tend to be asset taxes. And asset taxes tend to hit poor people or lower middle income people extremely hard. So one of the things, for example, when there are so-called wealth taxes incorporated into welfare programs, a lot of people who live in the country, a lot of indigenous people, for example, find that their snow machines or their boats are considered assets, and they're supposed to sell them to support themselves before they get welfare. Well, a snow machine is like $10,000. I don't know, $20,000. I don't know how much it costs, but it's not Elon Musk style wealth, and they're very important for people who hunt. They're a very important part of the lifestyle. Farmland is an incredible source of wealth, but it's essential to the kind of work people do. So I think you're handing something. I think you're handing a very dangerous weapon over to the civil servants who are going to administer a program when you start talking about wealth taxes. I think you have to be very, very careful about what you're doing. There's the housing is a problem. The real estate investment is a problem. And that's why I'm ambivalent in this. I think a lot of money gets hidden in all kinds of ways. But the reality is that rich people avoid paying taxes in all kinds of ways. And I think we need to look very, very carefully at the other side of this, the tax side of it, when we talk about basic income.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, Thomas Piketty argues for a wealth tax, and one of the things that he thinks it could do is to actually, even if it's a very, very small wealth tax on very, very high levels of wealth, it could actually tell us who owns the wealth, right? Because we don't have any way of knowing that. We have a fairly good income system in many countries with advanced economies, although obviously things get through the cracks there as well, but we don't really know where the wealth is. Well, I know I could keep going on and on with these three panelists talking about these issues, but it is time to draw this session to a close. So let's start by thanking our panelists. Yay! Great job, everyone. And let me just give you a couple of closing notes here. Thank you all, of course, for attending this session. And I know it's been a very lively chat on the sidebar, which I have not been able to pay attention to. I'm hoping that'll be saved somehow. Great questions from our audience as well. A recording of the session will be available using the same link used to register and join the session. And join us to celebrate the end. We're at the end, this is the final plenary of the 20th annual big conference with a social hour in Kumo space, where we can continue the conversation with our conference attendees and speakers. I think the link to Kumo space is in the sidebar. Yes, there it is. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand off to the behind the scenes moderators, Mike Howard and Erin Ikuchi, for some conference closing remarks. I think I'm waiting for Mike or Ari to join in. I'm going to invite you on screen. Okay, there you are.
All right, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. Anyway, I'm Mike Howard, president of US Big, and I'm here with my fellow board member and US Big secretary, Eri Noguchi. And I'm going to give a quick review of the conference, and Eri will close with acknowledgements and some important announcements and reminders. Over the 2 decades US Big has been sponsoring conferences. Our goal has been to bring together activists, researchers, policymakers, and others interested in a basic income guarantee to share ideas, analysis, research, and strategies. This goal is reflected in our theme for this year: the stats, the stories, the steps. In other words, the research data, the lived experience of people, and how it is framed, and what we can do next, the steps. In all of these dimensions, we have come a long way from 50 people pulled together by one organization with literally no budget in a hotel conference room, piggybacking on the Eastern Economic Association, to this year, over 560 people attending, including over 120 in person, in our first ever hybrid conference. It's been the joint effort of 6 organizations together with funding from 4 sponsoring organizations. This, of course, reflects the remarkable growth of the movement in the last few years. This week, we've been presented with some of the growing body of data from diverse experiments, surveys, and pilot programs springing up all over the continent. We've heard stories of the participants in basic income projects about what it has meant to their lives to have income security and what it has meant to lose it. Some of this documented in brilliant new films. We've had lively discussions with people working at municipal, state, and federal levels to promote policies in the direction of a basic income, in some cases building on pandemic checks and the child tax credit expansion. We've heard from organizations involved in movement building, meeting here to compare best practices and strategies, next steps, and intersectional common interests. We've had exciting debates about universal versus targeted policies, how to change the narrative about poverty, and how to broaden the focus of guaranteed income research beyond labor market participation to include health, well-being, sustainability, resilience, and relationships. There were sobering talks on the barriers to guaranteed income policies in the context of existing welfare states, and illuminating analysis about how to frame policies to win support and give voice to people who have in the past been erased. I've been studying basic income for over 20 years, and I certainly learned a lot over the past 3 days. I encourage everyone to return to the website to view sessions you may have missed, encourage others you know to watch your favorite sessions, and join us next year. In the meantime, visit our websites, consider joining and supporting one or more of our organizations. We need you. And now I'll turn it over to Ari.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you all. So before we close out, there are some folks we would like to thank. First, please join me in extending our deepest gratitude to our sponsors, the Gerald Have Fun for Humanity, Steady Aid Kit, and the Humanity Forward Foundation. Thank you especially to Giselle Huff for being an early supporter when this conference was a mere concept. Thank you to all the moderators who volunteered their time to prepare for their sessions and helped to make each session run smoothly. And speaking of running smoothly, thank you to all of you behind the scenes providing tech and logistical support, not just during the conference, but the many weeks leading up to this moment. Thank you to the conference organizing committee, whom I will name. Thank you, Aliza, Annie, Chelsea, Erica, Gloria, Kimberly, Larry, Max, Mike, Robert, Sheila, Sid, Stacy, and Tim, and your respective organizations, Income Movement, U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network, Humanity Forward, Basic Income Canada Network, and the Basic Income Canada Youth Network and UBI Center. And please join me in giving a standing ovation to our conference manager, Hannah Wan, who kept us moving, organized, coordinated, and in her gentle but persistent manner, nudged us when we needed nudging. Hannah, thank you. I would be remiss if I forgot to thank all of you, the panelists and participants, the attendees, both in person and virtual, for you contribute to this community focused on basic income in so many meaningful ways. Thank you for being here. And as has been mentioned multiple times, recordings of all the sessions will be available in Crowdcast, and you can access them using the same link to join the sessions. Live streamed and virtual sessions are immediately available, and the recorded sessions that took place downstairs will be available in a week or two. Please fill out the end of conference survey. The link has been posted in the chat a few times. Probably it will be again, so that we can better plan for next year. We hope to see you in September at the many events being planned for Basic Income Week, including but not limited to the Basic Income March on September 24th. And one last thing, as has already been mentioned, please connect to each other in Kumo space. And now we close, and we hope to see you next year.